Do you salt your food? Do people look at you weird when you put salt in your water? How about if you put salt in your coffee? These are some things I've been doing myself, but I wanted to learn more about salt from the Redmond's Real Salt family. So we are going to learn all about salt today. Get ready. Some fun facts about salt.
Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey, are you an aging athlete? Are you over 40 and struggling to get your desired results? I understand your frustrations. If you're like me, you're trying to get your running back or your cycling back or whatever sport you love to do, and you just can't figure out what's missing in your performance gains. How is your training and fueling program working for you? That's what I do. I personalize your nutrition and health program for you based on a bunch of different things. We collect data, collect clues from nutritional therapy assessment, from a food log with symptoms. Look at your genetics. If you've done something as DNA fit, look at blood chemistry panels. Let's look at functional lab tests as a Vibrant Wellness wheat zoomer to test if you have leaky gut and sensitivity to wheat, peptides in foods. Look at food sensitivity labs. And Dutch tests, look at your hormones. So we look at all these hidden internal sources of chronic stress that may be impacting your ability to burn fat, improve performance, and longevity. So if you want to talk about how we can personalize your fueling, training, and performance plan, let me know. Set up a discovery call. Head to my website, debbiepotts.net, and reach out. Set up a call and we can chat about how I can help you be the best version of yourself. So you can stop blaming the aging process and instead change your mindset that you're embracing the change, that we train differently in our 40s and up versus what you did when you're 20, 30-year-old. We need to adjust how we eat, when we eat, why and how, but also match our nutrition with our exercise program and add some more health building lifestyle habits into our day. I call this all the holistic method comprehensive coaching program, where I work on individualizing clients' nutrition, exercise, stress reduction, sleep, movement, time outside, digestion and gut health, hydration, and my favorite, happiness, play, and laughter. So if you want to know more how you can be your best self, live your best life, and perform your best, head to debbiepotts.net, schedule a discovery call with me, and we can get started on your new health building journey. You can be that amazing athlete and stop blaming the aging process. So today I'm talking to Darryl Bosshardt from Redmond Real Salt, and he's one of the family members as this is a family-run business. He loves to talk about salt, and today we geek out about salt and the history of salt and why we need it, and a lot of the myths that go around salt. It's often overlooked and misunderstood, but a key element of life. In terms of importance, salt is right at the top of the list behind oxygen and water. But why is it demonized? Why is it mistakenly demonized that we just don't need salt and salt is bad for you, especially if you have high blood pressure? People are afraid of sodium and taking in too much salt. So we are going to talk about the need for electrolytes and minerals and balancing your minerals, talking about nutrition, keto. We didn't get into fasting today and really much about keto, but clean eating, cleansing, fermenting foods, they all play a role on the amount of salt that we need and use in our foods. So let's dive in some of these topics. Is salt really bad for me? Should I eliminate sodium from my diet? Is sea salt better for me than real salt? What is real salt? What is pink salt, red salt, black salt? How is it made? What should we look for when we're looking for natural salt? I don't want to have the heavy toxic metals that can be in some of those packaged salts, especially when we're at, TJ Maxx. You'll see this big, huge bag of salt, Himalayan real salt, and it's only, say, $2. And you kind of have to wonder, you get what you pay for. So what do we want to look for to get quality salt? What is the right amount for me? How much should I use on my food? How do I know I've had too much salt? So we're going to dive into that. Now, a little bit about Redmond's real salt. If you don't go to conferences in our space and low carb community health field, Redmond's real salt is always a big sponsor of events. And it's a brand of unrefined sea salt that is harvested from ancient salt deposit in Redmond, Utah area. It's untouched by modern pollution and is located deep within the earth, where it's been protected from contaminants for thousands of years. So we get the natural source. Redmond's real salt is derived from underground salt deposit. We'll talk about that. And it's unrefined processing. Redmond's real salt is not subjected to the extensive refining processing that other table salt goes through. And we'll talk about that. It retains many of the minerals and trace elements presented in the original salt deposit. Trace minerals and trace elements are found in Redmond's real salt, include calcium, magnesium, potassium, and various other minerals in trace amounts. These minerals can contribute to the distinctive flavor and color. There's no additives. That Redmond's real salt typically does not contain additives and anti-caking agents or iodine, which are often added to table salt. So Redmond's real salt does provide some minerals. It's important to note that mineral content in sea salt is relatively low compared to the daily recommended intake of these minerals through a balanced diet. The minerals presented in sea salt, including Redmond's real salt, are typically presented in trace amounts and are not a primary dietary source of these nutrients. The main appeal of such salts are often their unique flavor and the fact that they're minimally processed and closer to their natural state of highly refined table salt. So you can check out on Facebook, there's Redmond Real Salt and Redmond Real Light, and hopefully we'll get a discount code if you want to try it out. Let me know. All right, real quick, a couple things I thought I'd look up. Are sodium and salt the same thing? What's the difference? So we've got salt is a chemical compound primarily composed of sodium chloride. In everyday language, salt is referred to table salt, which is mostly sodium chloride. There's various types of salts composed of different chemical compounds that can include other minerals and elements in addition to sodium chloride. Sodium is an element, salt is a compound that contains sodium as one of its components, typically the form of, as I already said, sodium chloride. So when people talk about sodium content in food, they are usually referring to the amount of sodium present in the form of salt or sodium-containing compounds. Just something I thought I'd look up. All right, and then we talk in the podcast about extracellular versus intracellular fluid and the need to keep it balanced. So that's the compartments within the body. And we want to maintain a balance between the cells, what's out of the cell, extracellular and intracellular. Sodium plays a significant role in maintaining the balance. So we've got extracellular fluid. This includes the body fluids outside the cells. It is further divided into two main components you may hear about: interstitial fluid found in the spaces between the cells. And then we have plasma, the liquid portion of the blood. And then we have intracellular fluid. This is a fluid within the body's cells, inside. This accounts for most of the body's total water content. What is the role of sodium? Why do we need it? Well, sodium is one of the primary electrolytes found in the extracellular fluid. So we'll hear about this potassium-sodium pump. It plays a vital role in maintaining proper fluid balance in the body. Sodium is responsible for regulating the volume of extracellular fluid. Its levels are tightly controlled to prevent excessive fluid loss or retention, which can lead to various health issues. Now, when we talk about the extracellular to intracellular balance, sodium helps regulate the movement of water across the cell membranes. This movement of water is critical for maintaining a proper balance between the intracellular and extracellular components. So, fun fact, might bring you back to science elementary school projects we did. Now, if the sodium concentration is off balance, there's too much sodium in the extracellular fluid, water will move out of the cells and leading to cell dehydration. If there's too little sodium, water can flow into the cells, causing them to swell, which I have happen when I fly. The balance of sodium between the extra and intracellular fluid is closely regulated by various mechanisms, sodium-potassium pump, which actively transports sodium out of the cells and potassium into the cells. This pump helps maintain the resting membrane potential of cells and is essential for proper nerve and muscle function. So, sodium's role in maintaining extra and intracellular balance is primarily related to regulating fluid volume and osmotic pressure. Proper sodium balance is crucial for overall cellular function, and it ensures that cells are neither dehydrated or overhydrated, allowing them to function optimally. Imbalance in sodium levels can have a serious health consequence, including dehydration, edema, and disruptions in nerve and muscle function. Just fun facts for you, as I think as athletes, we really want to know about hydrating and mineral balancing and really looking at how to be fit and healthy from the inside out at a cellular level. So fun facts. You can fast forward if you don't find this interesting next time. But I like to know why. All right. I've been actually looking forward to this podcast for a few months since we booked it with Darryl from Redmond's Salt, Real Salt. We're going to talk all things real salt and why we love it and why we use it and why we have a 10-pound bag at home. So Darryl, thanks for coming on the show. I seriously kept looking at when is that podcast? Because we booked this a few months ago and it's something we always talk about in the low carb community and keto, the low carb cruise with all people that are big fans of yours. We are all about Redmond's Real Salt. So thanks for bringing some light on salt.
Debbie, it's great to be on the program today. Thank you so much. People here, we're going to talk about salt, and some people think that's got to be the most boring topic in the world. But I just love talking about salt, and hopefully some of your listeners will learn something new today.
Good. I know. It's not we have video. I have my spider cobweb cleaner over there. So hopefully I should change my camera. I'm in my glass house and it's cobweb season. So I have to sweep around me. So no distractions. So I want to talk about what is Redmond's Real Salt, because it's a family-owned business and it's a mining salt. Can we just talk about what is Redmond's sea salt, how it started?
Yeah. So people hear of salt and they hear that Redmond is out of Utah. And the first thing they think of is the Great Salt Lake because they've heard about all of this salt in Utah. And it would be a good guess, but Redmond comes from about 2 hours south of the Great Salt Lake. Geologists tell us there was an inland sea back during the Jurassic era. And this inland sea, which geologists would put about 150 million years ago in late Jurassic period. This ancient inland sea was eventually cut off and buried under, volcanic activity. And then as Utah and the Great Basin was pushed up, this inland sea, this prehistoric seabed with this natural mineral salt was pushed up right along with the Great Basin. And then the Native Americans saw the animals pawing at the ground and eating the soil, and so that's how they found the deposit originally. Then when the settlers kind of came through Utah in the 1800s, they noticed that the salt had been uncovered. The Native Americans had moved on. They weren't here at the time, but they had seen the salt was uncovered. And so my grandfather had this farm here in central Utah. They did alfalfa and corn and barley, and just north and south of the farm, there were these little outcroppings of salt that had been harvested long before the settlers had kind of come through central Utah. And so in the 1950s, the salt, or the farm rather, wasn't doing that well. There was a big drought in the 1950s. And so my grandfather and his brother decided to go into the salt business. And in World War II, my grandfather was a riveter and a business manager at McDonnell Douglas in California. And his brother was a miner in Kennecott, the big copper mine here in Utah. So they had some business experience and some mining experience. And so they decided to go into the salt business back in the 1950s. And that's how we got into salt in central Utah.
Yeah, because I've been to Salt Lake City just to go up to Park City, which walking around the old town there, I didn't realize the history of it was all mining town back then. It's interesting background, because I actually just had a client that's from there and she had heavy metal toxicity. I thought I went down some rabbit hole going, well, I wonder where it's their workplace and what's going on in there. But I went down to the history of Park City and Salt Lake, the mining towns.
Yeah, there's a lot of mining in Park City. A lot of silver mines was the big thing there in Park City. And here in Utah, actually, coal and radon is a big problem because of the seepage. Around Park City, there's actually quite a bit of radon that people have to mitigate in their homes because of the fissures that kind of come up through there. But this is, a couple hundred miles south of there, and very different from the Park City mining district that sounds like your client's familiar with.
Yeah. So with salt, you mine it. How's it salt come in a bottle? How do we get salt?
So
what is salt?
There's really a couple of different ways that salt can be produced. And if we went back 100 years ago or 200, 300,000 years ago, salt was produced differently than it is today. And so there's a couple of main ways. So if we went back and looked at early man, salt was essential for life. It was a source of trade. It was essential for food preservation, for human health, for animal health. In fact, every civilization started around access to the salt deposits, because without salt, everything starts to die. In order of importance, we have oxygen. Obviously, if the oxygen were sucked out of the room, we would know in a hurry. And then water is the next important. And then salt is the third. You can live a long time without food, and some of you could live longer than others, depending on, how many extra calories we have packing around with us. But would have a tougher time living very long without oxygen. We'd have a very tough time living very long without water, and a very tough time without salt. And that's why our native ancestors, salt was so essential. In fact, some of you may have heard the old saying, is a man worth his salt? And that saying comes because in the times of Rome, soldiers were paid a salary, or saline, based on the term salt. They were paid a wage in salt. And so if you weren't working hard or earning your keep, you weren't worth the salt you were paid. And so that idea is man worth his salt comes because of the value that salt had. Every religious text, every history book, salt has always been essential for life. And yet, a few years ago, maybe 50, 60 years ago, everybody thought salt was bad for them. And there was this study that was published in the 1950s that said all salt's bad. It was a faulty study, kind of like, you go back not too many years ago and everybody thought that all fat was bad. And so we went through this craze where, all fat bar none was bad. We should avoid it and we should just eat a bunch of carbs. And now we realize that actually our bodies have to have good fats to live and actually live better than on these super heavy processed carb diets that, we kind of became all the rage, in the last 20 years or so. And so salt, it's just really fun because it's had this really interesting history. And without salt, everything dies. And the first thing that will happen if you go to the hospital is they're going to give you an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. And so, in fact, an IV of distilled water, an IV of tap water, an IV of coffee, that might sound good in the morning. I mean, any of those things would kill us. It has to be saline solution or lactated ringers, which is a electrolyte solution with sodium chloride, calcium chloride, potassium chloride. These essential electrolytes balance our body, and they're essential And so we need to kind of throw that idea out that all salt's bad or that salt itself is bad. It's just that the form and the nature of salt. I kind of went on a little tangent there before we talk about how salt's produced,
Yeah.
but hopefully they can see why this is such an important topic.
Well, it's pretty interesting that you say salt's essential for life, but as with everything we've had over the years, I don't know, last 50 plus years, that things are good or bad. And salt is bad for us. And if you have high blood pressure, you need to avoid it and you can't do this. Salt's just bad. And it's also, you're saying, essential. And there's essential minerals, and we need mineral balancing to keep us alive. And so I think it's, where the bad rap of salt came, because maybe if it's the history of what type of salt started to make things bad versus quality of salt and the source of it. Is there, touch on that?
You're absolutely right. So, as I mentioned before, salt was always essential for life. In fact, before the refrigerator, all of us probably would have eaten more salt, because anything we ate outside of season would have had to have been preserved with salt. Our kimchis, our sauerkraut, our pickles, our jerkies. But the salt that our ancestors used versus walking into the grocery store and buying a blue canister or white canister of salt off the shelf, those are two very different things. And that's why our ancestors knew salt, loved salt. Animals don't overdose on salt. And yet today, because salt is a great preservative, salt can be used on foods that should not last or should not be eaten even, to make the food last longer than it should. And it's a cheap preservative. And so now we have poor food that demineralize, bleached white flours, refined sugars, and then we add a copious amount of processed salt, and we wonder why we feel crappy. But it's not the natural salt's fault. It's all the stuff that happens before we get there. And so this would be a good time to go back and talk about how the nature of salt changed. So if we went back, a few thousand years ago and we lived by the ocean, what we would do is we'd go over to the ocean and we would gather the seawater. Seawater occurs around 2 to 3% salts. And it's not just pure sodium chloride. It's got other calcium chloride, magnesium chloride. Seawater has iodine, which is why seafood and seaweed is rich in iodine. And so we would take that seawater, we would gather it in a pot or a pan and put it on the fire and evaporate that water off. And eventually it'll go from 3% salt to 4 to 5 to 6. At 26% salt, that water is at max salinity, so it can't hold any more salt in solution. And so the salt will start to fall out of suspension onto the bottom of that pan. And we can make a little pot of salt doing that. Again, it's 3%, kind of like if you were making, honey, or not honey. Well, yeah, honey, or even maple syrup. You get that maple from the trees and it's very watery, and you boil it down until you get syrup. And salt would be kind of similar. You can start with the seawater. It's 2%. You boil it all down to get all the water out, and then you're left with this little layer of salt crystals. And if you do that in a single pot, you will have all of the sea minerals there in that pot with the salt. Now, that's hard to do in a commercial application in a little pan. I mean, you could do it in your kitchen, but what bigger salt manufacturers would do, and what our ancestors would do, is they would take clay and they would make a pond near the seashore, and clay doesn't allow the seawater to go back into the sand. And so if you take a gray clay and you line a pond and you bring the seawater in and let the hot Mediterranean air evaporate off the water, when the salt crystals fall out of suspension onto the bottom of the pond, we can take a rake and rake up those salt crystals along with that gray clay, and we'll get French gray salt. And that gray color is coming from that clay mineral as well as the full spectrum of minerals. And it's a beautiful, healthy, clean salt. And that was how the French gray comes from. Now, if we lived in Hawaii and we had red clay, we would line the pond with red clay, and then we'd get this Hawaiian red salt, because the red clay is now pulled up with the salt crystals.
Same with lava. Salt you get there too.
Yep. And you could have some activated charcoal in that pot, and then you get this black activated charcoal salt. Now, if you didn't live by the coast, the other option for our ancestors was to find an ancient prehistoric seabed. And so there are these seabeds like the one here in Utah that I mentioned that was during the Jurassic era that was laid down, evaporated, and preserved, eons ago.
I just think of Jurassic, by the way, as Jurassic Park, the movie series. So Jurassic is a time, not just a movie.
Yes. It's and I wasn't alive to confirm any of the dates, but geologists would tell us it's about 150 million years ago is what geologists would say. And so this ancient seabed now, our early ancestors would watch the animals find these salt deposits that have been pushed up near the surface, and then you could harvest the salt that way. And so it's very similar to that process that we can watch that occurs in France, or we could occur in Spain, or occur in the Gulf of Mexico, the San Francisco Bay. But it happened, long ago, long before we had some of the challenges that our oceans have today, because unfortunately, we humans haven't been the best stewards of the planet, and water being the universal solvent, it doesn't take a whole long time for Exxon Valdez spill up in Alaska to make its way all the way down the coast of California and down through South America, or the BP oil spill, or the Japan nuclear disaster. So there are some challenges with current oceans that the dinosaurs, back in the Jurassic Park movie, didn't have to worry about. Now, there may have been some other, pollution and problems that they had to worry about, but it's not the microbeads and the plastics that we have in our ocean waters today. And so there are some of these prehistoric seabeds with salt that occur. We know of one in Bolivia called the Bolivian pink salt. It's a really nice, clean salt from Bolivia. There's the Himalayan pink salt, which is an ancient seabed that occurs in Pakistan and Nepal. And then there's the Redmond real salt that occurs here in Utah. And geologically, those are all very similar, which would make sense because they're all prehistoric seabeds. And even though you might be in South America or Alaska, the content of the seawater isn't substantially different outside of, man, getting in the way.
So interesting. So with that, you're talking about the heavy metals. I know a lot of people are afraid of salt and having salt because it's going to have, raise their blood pressure. It's bad for you, but also the heavy metals in it, and iodine and no iodine. And so how do we clarify, not that there's good or bad, but good or bad quality? We're looking for, I always think, food, nutrient dense whole foods that have the most quality in it. So what would you say for the salt? How is Redmond's, as a great example, a good quality salt that is free of heavy metals?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as part of that, let's talk about the refining process that salt from the oceans or salt from underground goes through. Now, because we live on the planet Earth and all of the earth minerals are everywhere, there's going to be trace amounts of heavy metals in really trace amounts everywhere. If you go out and you buy some sunflower seeds, or you even go to a very virgin soil that's never been near any type of petroleum manufacturing, because we live on the planet Earth, there's going to be ultra trace amounts of mercury, lead, aluminum, because we live on the planet Earth and all of these things are present. Now, there's a big difference in a very trace or ultra trace amount of something and being near a fired power plant where you've got all of this pollution and toxicity that man is introducing into the environment. And so those are two very different things. And so we need to be aware of that as we're looking at our food source. And so in natural salt, yes, there is a trace and ultra trace amounts of some of these, which would normally be called, heavy metals. There's aluminum is an interesting one because, we know that refined aluminum is toxic and it's bad. However, in nature, aluminum doesn't occur as pure aluminum. It's bounded with silicate, and aluminum silicate is very different in the body than refined, pure aluminum. And so something to keep in mind there. But salt in the oceans, there's a series of processes that start to take place. About the turn of the century, salt manufacturers realized that seawater occurs with potassium chloride calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, as well as sodium chloride, which is what our bodies are based on. We are sodium chloride-based creatures. If you went to the hospital, it would be extremely rare to get any IV other than a sodium chloride-based IV. Potassium chloride IV may be in a really unique situation, but that's also deadly. Potassium chloride is the form of lethal injection. So you do need all these electrolytes in the right form. What salt companies realized, though, around the turn of the century, is they could, instead of taking the seawater out of the ocean into a single pond and letting it all evaporate at once, like we talked about earlier, salt companies realized that they could use a different membrane or a different liner in that pond, and they could pull off all of the seawater into the pond, and they could leach off the magnesium chloride first. Then they can move the salt to another pond and pull out the potassium chloride. Then they can move the water to the next pond and pull out calcium chloride. Now, those are valuable minerals, and our bodies need, because of the sodium-potassium pump, our bodies need potassium to process sodium. And they work synergistically in the body. And so by starting with good, clean seawater that our bodies are based on, and then taking out some of these other complex chlorides, it would be like if you and I were orange or citrus farmers and we came up with this really cutting-edge technology to take a grapefruit, pull out all the ascorbic acid and vitamin C, and then still sell it as grapefruit. And it looks mostly the same, and it probably tastes similar, but it's not. If we were to take a carrot, we know carrots are rich in beta carotene, not refined beta carotene, but beta carotene vitamin A complex, and we could take that carrot and extract all of the vitamin A out of it, sell the vitamin A in a little capsule, and then still sell the carrots in the grocery store. As farmers, we're probably geniuses. But as a nutritionist, we would say, why in the world would you buy a carrot after you've pulled out the vitamin A? Or why would you buy citrus if you've already removed the vitamin C? And why would you buy salt if you've already taken away the other key electrolytes that nature created salt with? And so now salt has two challenges. So the first is a lot of salts today, if it's coming from a current ocean or even a seabed, they're using vacuum pan evaporation. They can, through a series of processes, remove some of those other key electrolytes. That's problem number one, which is a problem, but none of those electrolytes occur in high enough forms to be considered a dietary source of magnesium. Yes, there's some magnesium in natural salt, but it's not enough to give your body what it needs. Same thing with potassium. So it's important that we leave salt and we get all those micronutrients out of it. But the bigger challenge, in my opinion, with salt is when we start to monkey with the chemistry. And years ago, salt was discovered that it's hygroscopic. So if I have a salt crystal here and I put it out on my table and it's a really humid day, it's going to start sucking water out of the air. It's called hygroscopic, and I would have a pool of water underneath my salt crystal because it's that efficient in sucking water out of the air. Now, it's kind of interesting because salt's job in the body is to regulate intercellular and extracellular fluids. That's one of salt's, among many things. Salt plays dozens of roles in the body as far as, cleansing and electrolyte balancing and electric charge. Cleansing the cells. There's so many things that salt does, but one of the big things is regulates moisture. And scientists noticed this, and so this study back in the 1950s that linked salt to high blood pressure was because they knew that salt did interact with the body's ability to interact with moisture. And so what they did in that study in the 1950s, I can send you a copy of it if you'd like.
Yeah.
The study's called Evidence for the Relationship Between Sodium Chloride Intake and Human Essential Hypertension, published in 1954. And this study, they fed mice this copious amounts of salt, and they noticed with high amounts of salt and little water, sure enough, it caused some hypertension. But if it's in the right form and the animal has enough water, it doesn't do that because animals are a lot smarter than we are, and they tend to balance their bodies better than some of us humans do. But salt companies The problem with salt being hygroscopic is it starts to absorb water into the shaker. And so on a humid day, your salt will start to clump in the shaker. So our grandma knew that, and she'd put rice in the salt.
I just had a flashback. We had a boat growing up in Vancouver, Canada, and we'd have weird things of rice in our salt shakers on the boat.
And that's why. Yep. Just like you'd put your cell phone in a bag of rice to help absorb the moisture, you can put rice in your salt to help the salt stop retaining moisture. And salt, in nature, it does that. Salt's job, because of the way it interacts with moisture in the body, it does the same thing in the air. And so a group of scientists got together and said, okay, what can we do? What chemical could we paint or coat this crystal with to stop its ability to interact with moisture? Because if we can do that, and we have all these little salt crystals in the shaker, and if we can coat every one of those with a chemical to stop that salt's ability to interact with moisture, then when it's raining outside, then the salt will still pour out of the shaker. And so this marketing campaign with this cute little umbrella girl, and it says, when it rains, it pours, and the salt is trickling out of the shaker as it's raining all over her.
Oh,
that's because the salt crystals are coated with a chemical to stop its ability to interact with moisture. And I think that's the bigger problem with salt today is, yes, we do want salt that's not been processed, so we get the full spectrum of salt the way nature created it. But the bigger challenge is this chemical, and there's dozens of chemicals that a manufacturer can choose from to coat that crystal with. A few of them, one of the meaner ones, is called yellow prussiate of soda. If you looked up prussiate of soda, it's sodium ferrocyanide.
Oh,
sodium,
cyanide doesn't make it sound
cyanide.
Very good.
Ferrous is iron. And there's even some salt companies, they got approved. There's an anti-caking agent sometimes you will see that says anti-caking agent E535. And you can list that on your label, anti-caking E535. If you Google search anti-caking E535, it pulls up sodium ferrocyanide. And that's a very common additive in many of your salts, even many of your quote unquote sea salts today will have that in. Now there's other ones. There's sodium silicoaluminate, very similar to the antiperspirant aluminum that's added to stop the body's interacting with moisture. There's other ones, calcium silicate, that aren't, as problematic. Sometimes they'll add sodium bicarbonate, which is basically baking soda, and they can add these other chemicals. But some of these chemicals are pretty mean. And if you ever take your salt shaker and you look at the ingredient label and you see 4 or 5 things, and one of those is often dextrose. There's that Mary Poppins song, just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And if your salt has dextrose, which is sugar in it, it's like just a spoonful of sugar helps the processed salt go down, and it's actually not added. The dextrose in salt isn't added as a sweetener. It's actually added as a stabilizer, because some of the chemicals that are added to the salt, they start to age. Salt doesn't expire. It's been around since the dawn of time. But these chemicals that we add to salt can impact it in such a way that salt companies will add dextrose as a preservative to salt, or to the chemicals that they've added to the salt. And so one of the first things I'll tell people is when you give a presentation and we say, who has heard that sea salt's better for them? And, just about everybody will raise their hand. And if we went back, maybe 40 years ago, that might have been the case. But today you can go into the grocery store and buy a sea salt and look at the label, and there can be more chemicals added to the sea salt, and it can still be demineralized more than maybe some brand of table salt. And so obviously I'm a little biased, and I think Redmond salt is the best salt, but there's some other really good salts out there. And so rather than looking at a label, or even rather than looking at a brand, look at the back of the label and
For
see.
everything, though, everybody needs to always look at the back. Don't just read the front. I've always thought that.
And in salt, there's really just three questions. And if any of your audience today wants to find a good, healthy salt, I tell them, hey, there's only three things you need to remember. And you can ask yourself these three questions, and you might end up with Redmond real salt from my grandfather's farm. And if you do, great. I'd love it. And I do think it's one of the healthiest, tasty salts out there. But these three questions, you might find another great brand, because there's some other really good brands out there, and we're not the only game in town. And especially if you live in other parts of the world and you're tuning in, there's probably some good salts where you're from without having to import real salt all the way from, Central America, Central North America here in Utah, all the way down to Bolivia, because there's some really good salt that's manufactured in a great way in Bolivia. And so there's no reason to, ship our salt down there if you've got, if you can do it without all the food miles. And so these three questions, if I piqued any interest yet.
Yeah, go for it.
So the first one is who is producing it? It kind of goes without saying, but in salt, it's very difficult to walk into a grocery store today and there's dozens of brands of salt and know actually who's produced that salt, because it might be in a store brand, it might be in just some jar, but knowing who's producing it gets very difficult in today. And, same thing if you were going to go buy some eggs. If you can know actually who the farmer is that's raising those eggs, then you're going to be raising the chickens that lay the eggs, then you can ask the next question, which is what's the source? Where is this protein coming from? If I'm going to buy a nice steak or some hamburger or some tomatoes, who is producing it is great. And if you can find out who's producing it, you can ask them what's the source. Is the kale coming from a garden or a farm that's raising it without pesticides and all the other kind of chemicals in the soil? Is the animal that I'm eating, is this fish or this, cow or whatever, what's the source? Where is it coming from? And then the next question would be, what's the process? If it's an animal, what are they doing to it? Are they adding hormones? Are they putting anything in? Are they taking anything out? In the case of salt, we want to know both of those. Are they taking any of the minerals out, and are they adding any other chemicals to it? And I think if we can know the source, if we can know who's producing it, and we can know the process, it doesn't matter what food we're eating. I think we're going to end up with a lot better food quality, no matter the brand.
Yeah. Food. Yeah, for sure. It's that whole thing of, ideally not buy food with a label, but read the ingredient list, find out those great questions. Who's producing it? What is the source? What is the process? And I think that goes for everything you use and eat, consume on your body and in your mouth. So can we touch on electrolytes? Because athletes, we're working out in, summertime, and I was just in Palm Desert. It's dry. I feel like I always have to have more electrolytes, and I get that dry mouth, and I'll put just the sea salt in my water. Let's talk about what are electrolytes, mineral balancing, and how we need a certain amount, because that gets confusing. You'll hear some people in our space say, I can have 10,000 milligrams of sodium a day, and they're doing great. And other, listen to all the other people in the low carb community can tolerate a lot more, and people are, I think, scared of that. And how do you figure out what works best for you as a unique individual? So let's start with electrolytes.
Yeah, so electrolytes are essential. I mean, the term electrolyte is because it's something that conducts electricity. And our bodies, we talked about before, outside of a spiritual discussion, the only difference in you and I visiting here 1 minute and both of us being dead the next minute, outside of a spiritual discussion, is just the absence of an electric current. And my hand moves because of an electric impulse firing through the muscles. And my mouth and my thoughts are because of electrical neurons and conductivity. And distilled water is a very poor conductor of electricity. So we have to have minerals and electrolytes, the key being sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. Those four, and then chloride, are the major electrolytes that keep our bodies functioning. And this is why if you go to the hospital, even if you have high blood pressure, even if you have water retention, the first thing that the hospital will do is they're going to start you on an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. Now, even if you have high blood pressure, that's what you're going to get, because if they gave you an IV of distilled water, your cells would start to shrivel. If they give you an IV of tap water, the cells would start to rupture. You have to have 0.9% saline, and that's what our bodies are based on. And if you take a saline rinse, you can rinse your eyes. It doesn't burn. There's no sensation. You can pump saline up your nose. There's no sensation, because our bodies are balanced by this saline. If you flush your nose with distilled water, or if you rinse your eyes with distilled water, they'll get really sticky, because our bodies have to have that natural saline. And so our tears are salt, our sweat is salt, our urine is salt. So we have to always be replacing that salt. And if we drink distilled water, which there's not a problem with that necessarily, because with all of the worries about the impurities in our water today, distilling and reverse osmosis is a great way to get rid of some of that. The pharmaceuticals that might end up in your water supply, you can't get those out with a normal filter, so you'd have to use something else to do that. However, you've got to replace those salts when you do that, because if we don't replace those lost salts, things start to go south. And we'll see that in the military camps. They're drinking tons of water, they're running out, they're sweating heavy packs on, and somebody will fall, pass out, and even occasionally die from hyponatremia. And natremia is salt and sodium. And so we have to always be replacing those. And everybody's level is different. Now, our ancestors never would have thought about overdosing on salt. They had to go out of their way to get salt. And so as you start eating a more healthy diet and you're eating food without labels, you'll have to actually start adding salt to your diet and adding salt to your water. And if you start feeling and listening to your body talk, you'll be able to find out what that right amount is for you. And if you're somebody who's in the sun a lot, you're a roofer, maybe you're a firefighter, you're even gardening a lot, all of the time you're sweating, you are sweating out salt. And so for somebody who is out in the sun, maybe they've got a lot of gear, they've got a pack, as you're sweating a lot, you're going to go through more water and more salt than somebody who has a more sedimentary, temperature-controlled lifestyle. And so it's really hard to say a blanket, this is a number. However, if you have access to water, humans have never overdosed on salt if it's in the right form, because your body craves water. Most humans don't overdose on water, right? In fact, most of us are probably dehydrated. And if you start listening to your body, when you're thirsty, you drink water. When you're not thirsty, you stop drinking water. And when you have a salt craving, a lot of us think today it's a sugar craving. It's actually salt. And if you think you're craving sugar, put a little piece of salt crystal under your tongue, and you'll find it tastes sweet. And it's actually quite satisfying, because oftentimes we're dehydrated and we're low on salt unless we're eating out of boxes and bags and cans and, bags of chips and bags of processed foods.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Dr. Ben Bigby always says that, just avoid eating out of eating food that comes in a bag or a box. It's simple, no barcode. So with the athlete, the electrolyte balance, we get so dehydrated training. It reminds me a few things of in Ironman. One, often finish line, you're kind of almost trying to get to the med tent so you can get that saline solution, so you can get rehydrated. I know Ben Greenfield, one year I helped him at Ironman Canada, and he it's like, you almost have to act like you're going to pass out, but you want that often to get that rehydration. And I always say that you don't sweat out water, you sweat out minerals. And so you need to always replace that, not just drinking plain water. And one more thing, on race courses, as I know Ironman Hawaii years ago started doing base salt. It was just handing out, a little container as you guys use at fairs, and then you just put on your tongue or wet your thumb, wipe it with the salt and then put it in. Same thing you're just saying, that just gives you the right amount. And if it tastes salty, you don't need it. So it's kind of that intuitive fueling to figure out your hydration is just go by taste.
Yes,
almost.
I think you're absolutely right. There was a great book years ago called Your Body's Many Cries for Water
I
by
had to
Dr.
read that
Batman-Gelly.
Nutritional Therapy School Association made us read that. It's a great book.
It's a great book. And he wrote a follow-up that said, you're not sick, you're thirsty.
Yeah.
And when we start drinking enough water to meet our dietary needs, and we're not eating foods with barcodes and labels, Dr. Batman-Gelly suggested that you should, salt your food liberally. And then for every quart of water you're drinking, you should add a quarter teaspoon of salt to that water. And so he had this formula. And so I've used Dr. Batman-Gelly's formula when I'm talking to mom groups and to sports clubs, because people know that they need to replace salt out on the football field. The Florida Gators were having this big problem with cramping and nauseousness because of all the loss of electrolytes. So they got together and created a product to aid the Florida Gators. But it started out as a good idea, but then it became, sugar and artificial colors and flavors and food coloring and all kinds of other stuff.
People might not have caught that. That means Gatorade, if you didn't know the history.
Yeah, Gatorade was created as a sports drink to aid the Florida Gators, but then added sugar and, artificial colors, artificial flavors, and you could make your own sports drink with a quart of good, clean water and a quarter teaspoon of good, clean salt, put in a squeeze of lemon or some agave or some fig syrup or whatever you like for a little bit of sweetener. And it is an amazing sports drink for pennies on the dollar without all the other garbage in it. Now, because our bodies do need potassium, calcium, and magnesium, in seawater and in natural salt, those exist, but not in the levels high enough for most of us. And if we looked at the diets of our ancestors, which scientists have done, they said that our ancestors ate foods a lot higher in potassium than we do today. And so many of us either need to find out or seek out good sources of food-based potassium, or in a lot of the supplements that we do, to find a good, clean source of additional potassium. So we make a electrolyte drink, we take the natural salt, and then we actually add additional potassium and magnesium and some calcium to that, because most people, yes, they need good, clean sodium, but they also need higher levels of potassium if they're not eating a diet with foods rich in potassium, because we need both of those. It's not just the sodium. And even though real salt and natural salts, Celtic, Himalayan, Hawaiian, Bolivian, they all have a little bit of potassium in them, it's not enough for most people if they're not eating a more natural diet that has higher levels of dietary potassium in it.
Yeah, and people can listen to my podcast I did on my hair tissue mineral analysis, HTMA test. That's how you can measure, great way to measure minerals and having them, the balance of them all, and then sources of heavy metals. It's interesting. It's just cutting, you have to cut a little bit of your hair from the roots, but it is that balance. And I was always low in potassium, and it is hard to get enough potassium. So I started drinking the Reelite more during the day and salting my food, but I find the effort is needed more to get that potassium, because I got some recipe to make potassium broth and it was way too much work for me, who's not a chef, but it was like, cut up all these vegetables, these potatoes, and saute them, and then just save the water and drink that. And that's your broth to get enough potassium minerals. But simple way, people don't want to do all that. They could just get the electrolyte blend to keep you in balance. Is there a chance if we just do, say, Redmond's real salt all over our food? And I find I have to salt everything, and I must be really low, because I do believe in intuitive fueling and intuitive eating, that I always want to salt everything, and even like put it in my coffee and put it on some almond butter with my apple. It just, salt just makes, I just have it on everything now. But is there a fear of are your body going to tell you if you are too much and you're out of balance? You're saying just it will taste differently, or you just don't, you feel like it's salty?
So taste is a big thing. Our bodies will let us know when it's the same thing with the big bottle of water. You come off a nice long run or a bike ride, that first glass of water tastes amazing. The fifth glass of water is going to start to feel like too much. And if we listen to our bodies, like that piece of salt, that tasted really good. This morning I was out working in the yard and went for a bike ride, and I know I'm a little salt deficient. Now, if I were to do that again, at some point, that's going to start to taste salty as my body says, hey, you know what? You've had enough. And you don't have that craving for that item. So I think animals are really smart, especially horses. If you ever watch a horse, they are very intentional eaters. They will, pick at this bark. They will eat this fence post. They're smart, and they listen to their bodies. And it seems like we humans have kind of forgot the importance of listening to our cravings. So that's a big part of it. Yeah. Now, if you're on dialysis and on kidney failure, just forget everything that we've said today, because a healthy kidney, Dr. David Brownstein would say, healthy kidneys could process 4 ounces of salt a day. So our kidneys have the ability to process high amounts of salt. In fact, a 1 liter bag of saline has more sodium than the daily recommended allowance, which is crazy to think about. Because you would think that one bag of saline would never have more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium, but yet it does. It has about 2,700. But it's because when it's in the right form, our bodies, you could get gallons of saline pumped through you. And as long as you have a catheter and you have other electrolytes to balance that, you're going to be fine, because our bodies are designed to be saline solution in motion. Our tears are salt, our sweat is salt, our urine is salt. And so our bodies aren't meant to be sugar overloaded. Yeah. And so if anything, it's not the salt that we need to avoid, it's the sugar, because the salt actually balances with enough water. Our bodies won't overdose on salt, and salt's what balances and keeps every system in our body functioning. The high amounts of refined carbs, the high amounts of sugar, that's what our bodies were never meant to run on. And if you go back to early man, they had access to salt, but they didn't have access to this super abundance of sugar. Like you had berries, you had some honey, but any of these things you had to go out of your way to get, where salt was readily available. And it had to be because it was so essential for life, which is why it was paid as a salary to the Roman soldiers, and it was traded ounce for ounce for gold at one point, because it was so essential to keep us alive and to keep our food preserved. So anyway, I kind of geek out on salt, but hopefully we've covered some fun stuff today.
Have you talked to Dr. Canberry a lot about that? Because he always has videos on this and talks about your salt shouldn't have a little blue girl with an umbrella on it. And he's just, it cracks me up. But that this is ancestral health, and look at the proper human diet, as he calls it, the PhD diet. But proper human diet ancestrally is looking at what we did once upon a time, and what your own body has its innate intelligence and how it can find the balance, which is even with the zinc. I wrote that down as in nutritional therapy. We do a zinc test. And if you swish it in your mouth, a zinc solution for, 30 seconds, if you can taste it or not, if it tastes like water, you're zinc deficient. So same kind of thing. If you can taste it really minerally, you don't need zinc. So that was an easy test. And then also, iodine test, and we'll talk about iodine next before we wrap up. But iodine, to wipe it on your arm, just do a little square, see how long it absorbs in your body. Is there other nutritional therapy tests we do in our functional exam we used to do? And then how fast your body absorbs it tells, are you iodine deficient or not? So it is amazing if you learn how to test your body's own innate intelligence, figure out where am I, and learn how to listen to those feedbacks, symptoms, that signs and symptoms your body gives you. It's pretty amazing.
And I think that's for me, that would just be a good thing to kind of to wrap up and close on. I think, if we can be more intentional in our living, be more intentional with the food that we choose to eat. And we all are going to have our cheat days and our cheat snacks and our cheat treats, which is fine. But I think if we can just be a little more intentional, and if we think we're craving a candy bar, or we think we're craving sugar, start by just putting a little piece of salt under your tongue and just see how sweet that natural salt crystal is, and see how satisfying that can be, and be more aware of if we're thirsty. So many of us go around dehydrated because we drink in the morning, and then, it's too late for bed. I don't want to get up and pee tonight, so I'm gonna not drink tonight. And so we go, walking around super dehydrated, super low in minerals, and then we get thirsty and there's, some cheap sugary drink close by, instead of being a little more intentional, saying, hey, I know at 4 o'clock at my desk, I'm going to have a sugar craving. Let me just get a little bit of salt. And so here at my desk, I've got actually a bowl of salt.
Nice.
And I'll just put a piece of salt under my tongue. And it's interesting how, for me at least, how satisfying, when I think I'm craving sugar, how satisfying that little bit of salt is.
Yeah. So we shouldn't drink plain water if we're trying to rehydrate with getting minerals in. And we shouldn't have sugar water to rehydrate, but just have minerals added to our water, or just start with salt. And then maybe if you need more, we might identify that we feel better having more, something as Real-Lite with electrolytes, balanced with the magnesium, potassium, calcium.
And one thing you can try, if you're not sleeping well, one of the things that Dr. David Brownstein would suggest is take a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, put it under your tongue, and a big glass of water right before bed. When we're sleeping, our bodies are cleansing.
Yeah.
The cells are cleansing, the mind's cleansing. It's kind of like a reboot, reset. And for all of that, our bodies need water and salt to do that. And so there's a lot of stories that Dr. David Brownstein shares about, restless legs and cramps at night and just not sleeping well, and a little bit of salt and, a glass of water before bed. If you went to the hospital or the IV tent, at the end of the Ironman, at the hospital, you're going to spend hundreds of dollars for that bag of saline solution, where you can make your own, essentially make your own bag and just give yourself a nice little, electrolyte boost before bed with a 1/4 teaspoon of salt and a big glass of water, and just see how you feel, and see if that helps sleep. And
that's a good tip.
Most people are surprised.
So before we wrap up, can you just touch on iodine? Because we talked a lot about iodine with Dr. Elizabeth Bright for females' hormones and men and women and thyroid issues, but that's a confusing thing of iodized salt versus no iodine, and anything you can add in there as we close.
Yeah, as iodine is essential for life. The lack of iodine sets up goiter, is one of the most known things, but they've done a lot of studies on tissue and on tumors in breasts and in prostate and thyroid and all kinds of these tumors, and they're all deficient in iodine. Now, the reason that we've come to associate iodine and salt, we actually have to go back to World War I. In World War I, they instituted the draft, and in the Midwest, think of the Midwest at the time, this is, early 1900s, in the Midwest, we're eating out of boxes, we're eating out of cans, we're eating out of processed flour, white sugar, white flour, and as they started the draft, they noticed that there was a high density of goiter problems in the Midwest. They're not eating seafood. They're kind of landlocked. They're not eating any kelp or dulse or seafood in general. And so the military got together with the Food and Drug and said, what do we do to solve this goiter problem? Because we can't have men drafted if they've got a big goiter. And so they said, what food can we add iodine to force it on the human population? Like some municipalities will add fluoride. It's a different discussion. They'll add fluoride to a water supply to force consumption of fluoride. And so the scientists got together and said, what food can we add iodine to force consumption of iodine? I would have loved to have had one of them say, hey, let's have a campaign on the importance of eating dulse or kelp or other seafood. They didn't. They said, people have to have salt to survive. And we can take potassium iodide, which is one form of iodine. We can add it to salt. It becomes somewhat stable. And then we can force people to eat more iodine. And because of the importance, we're going to create a law that says if you're a salt company and you don't add 45% of the RDA per 1/4 teaspoon in your salt, you have to put a warning that says this salt does not supply iodide, a necessary nutrient, even If natural salt like this has about 10% of your recommended daily allowance of iodine naturally, if you don't add an additional 45% of potassium iodide, that disclaimer is required. What's interesting is salt was never meant to be a source of iodine, even though there's a trace amount there. And as a follow-up, Dr. David Brownstein did a study called, and he published it in a book called Iodine, Why You Need It, Why You Can't Live Without It. And he shows that the iodine added to iodized salt is less than 10% bioavailable. So not only is it a processed form of iodine, it's not a very good source. Now, even at 10%, it's better than nothing. And so because iodine is so essential, if your only choice of iodine was iodized salt, that's better than zero iodine. Fortunately, we have a lot of other options. There's great foods that are rich in iodine, and there's some really good iodine supplements that are way better than a processed iodized salt. And so that's kind of the short version. Yes, as you point out, iodine is essential. Women, really absolutely essential. And a lot of men, reproductive wise and energy wise, and there's a lot of functions that iodine does for men, not just women. And most of us are iodine deficient because we're not eating enough dulse, we're not eating enough kelp, we're not eating enough seafood in general. And a lot of our foods have less iodine than it did years ago. So yes, iodine is essential, but iodized salt is not the place to get it.
Yeah, good. All right. So we're out of time, but where can people find Redmond's Real Salt and read some research and learn more? Where do we want to send them?
One of my favorite books on salt, if you want the geeky history side, is a book called Salt, A World History. It's an excellent book. You can find it on Amazon. It goes through all of the cool history of salt. For the health side, one of the easy places to start would be at our website, which is just real salt, as opposed to fake salt. It's realsalt.com. And that's a good place to start. There's a lot of great books. We talked about some of them today. Dr. David Brownstein's book called Salt Your Way to Health is a really good one. There's a Dr. James D. Nicolantonio called The Salt Fix, and he's got a lot of good.
It's a big book.
A lot of good information. I still like to go back to the old Dr. Batman Gelly, your body's many cries for water. Yeah. So there's a lot of good research on salt today. And I just appreciate having me on the program. And I can actually send, if you want it for your show notes, I can actually send you some PubMed articles from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and the American Journal of Medicine that talk about how important the right kind of salt is in a healthy diet.
I think so. That'd be great. And I think most of us are listening are endurance athletes doing a lot of volume of training outside, even though we should less is more is what I keep telling everyone, quality over quantity, but they are working out in sweating and not getting, hopefully people are getting off the processed foods, but just getting enough electrolytes in and figuring out how to keep them all in balance and how to know when you need some salt. And I think we gave some great tips and just simple things, put it in your mouth, a crystal and test. But I think that's an important part because I think a lot of performance issues are related to hydration status and figuring out, as Kona Ironman was just this past weekend, and you're sweating and doing, more humid weather racing. And that's always a big topic, is how to stay hydrated when you're training and racing and figure out the right amount so you're not swollen and, have too much going on, too much sodium. So listen to your body. We're saying there's innate intelligence and you have to learn how to rediscover that connection with your own body. It's the big thing. So thanks so much, Darryl. We'll put all the links in the show notes, and we have a discount code I'll put in there too. I know, I must tell you, I put on my Instagram, we have this olive tree up here that we first time ever are brining olives, and our 10-pound bag of real salt that I bought a year ago is going away very quickly because there's this whole brining process of making your olives every week with a cup of salt. So those 10-pound bags, I read on it, it does say for fermenting, brining, and using it for cooking. So if you're making a big project as that, having food for the winter, you have to have the salt for it. So it does come in handy. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
So do you have any more questions on real salt, mineral balancing, testing with HTMA, or perhaps how to keep getting the right nutrients through your foods to get these minerals in? So let's talk about electrolytes. And if you have any other questions, send them my way, debbiepotts.net, and we can do a follow-up on electrolytes and maybe look at the need for products as Real Light. And then we've talked to LMNT and looking at why do we need a little bit more sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and what is the right amount of each. So just to touch on electrolytes before we wrap up this long show today, because I go down all these rabbit holes. Electrolytes, they're ions, electrically charged particles that play a crucial role in the various physiological processes within the human body. These ions carry electrical charges and are essential for many bodily functions, including nerve function, muscle contraction, fluid balance, and the maintenance of the body's pH, that acid-base level. Now, you've heard of these common electrolytes in the human body include sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, and those are our key ones. Now, electrolytes are involved in several key functions. We talked about nerve function, sodium and potassium ions. They're essential for transmitting those nerve signals that we need to have quick when we're exercising. They help generate action potentials, which are electrical impulses that travel along nerve cells. Also, we talk about muscle function. Calcium, sodium, and potassium ions are essential for muscle contractions, another necessary part of our aging process and why we want to change how we train as well as refuel as aging athletes. So calcium, sodium, potassium are essential for muscle contractions. They allow the muscle cells to contract and relax. All right, and then we've got fluid balance. Electrolytes help regulate the balance of water and salts in the body. This balance is critical for maintaining blood pressure and overall hydration. And then we've got the acid-base balance as bicarbonate and phosphate ions play a role in regulating the body's pH level, helping to maintain proper acid base necessary for various biochemical processes. Electrolyte imbalances that we hear about with athletes, especially in Kona, racing in hot weather, dehydration, but then we also hear about excessive loss of electrolytes through conditions as diarrhea, vomiting, kidney problems that can lead to health issues. Whenever we have these imbalances, they can disrupt the nerve and muscle function, alter your fluid balance, and affect overall health. Now we know about sport drinks, as Gatorade we talked about. Sport drinks and electrolyte supplements are commonly used to replenish electrolytes during and after strenuous activity, particularly when there's a lot of sweating and fluid loss. Remember, we always say we don't sweat out water, we sweat out minerals. You know, at the end of a race, I was talking about people want to go get an IV because to get those electrolytes right in there with the IV of the saline solution to correct severe imbalances of dehydration. So it's really helpful after Ironman, for example. So we've got real salt versus table salt we talked about. And what are the differences? Just to wrap that up. Real salt is described, as we discussed, unrefined or minimally processed salts that are closer to their natural state. So we've got sea salt that's evaporating in seawater and collecting the salt crystals. It retains some of the trace minerals found in seawater. We've got the Himalayan pink salt mined from salt deposits in Himalayan mountains. And the real salts, as we talked about in Redmond, Utah, about mining the salts from years before. So we've got these various minerals and trace elements that can be in our Redmond real salt. Then we've got table salt. Table salt's always looked at as bad. But why is it Why is it not good for you? Table salt is highly refined, as we discussed, and very processed because they were trying to remove the impurities and most of the minerals, leaving just sodium chloride. But then they add anti-caking agents as calcium silicate and sodium aluminosilicate, often added to the table salt to prevent clumping. So we talked about that. Then we talked about iodine, and this is commonly added to table salt in many countries in the past because of the public health measure to prevent iodine, those goiters, prevent iodine deficiency leading to thyroid issues. So we have to remember the benefit getting the mineral content from real salts because they have retained the variety of minerals and trace elements naturally. Table salt is typically purified and lacks these additional minerals, and the flavor and texture will be different as well. So you can learn more if you want on Redmond's Real Salt website. I will put the links in the bottom here for the show notes and articles that Darryl was discussing. Hopefully you are listening to your body and learning how to add in that salt, as he was talking about. Take a salt crystal, just put it in your mouth. We did that in Ironman Hawaii. Just on the course, you lick some salt, just like a salt lick for an animal. You have that available. They can just lick salt when they're thirsty. So having the right balance of electrolytes, adding that potassium, magnesium, calcium with the sodium might be beneficial when you're doing more. If I'm going for a bike ride, I'll put a blend of the minerals. If it's Redmond's Real Salt, Real Light, or LMNT unflavored, because I don't do stevia, and just get those minerals and keep me hydrated. I also just been putting Redmond's Real Salt into my coffee in the morning. Really good with my butter and cream. It's amazing. French press coffee. And then I've been putting, when I do some, I know I'm not supposed to do almond butter all the time with almonds, but just almond butter or sunflower butter, you add some sea salt in that if I have some sliced apples and cheese. But salt, must be needing a lot because I'm salting everything. So listen to your body and see what it says. Let me know if you have any questions. Nutritional therapy works. We have an amazing innate intelligence we need to tap back into. Hey, my fellow aging endurance athletes, just a reminder, if you like what you listened to today, make sure to share this episode with your community. Head to debbypotts.net to set up a free discovery call to learn more about my personalized coaching programs, especially if you are on a mission as myself to improve the aging process and start training to be my best self when I am 80, 90 years old. So I am on a mission to live my best life and be my best self the second half of my life. So if you're on the same mission as me, head over to my website and YouTube channel to learn more ways to improve the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbypotts.net. You can help us continue and grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and see you next time.